Las Vegas, smoke in the air, sequins still catching the light, and Elvis Presley is not on stage. He is packing. The show is over. The crowd has screamed his name, begged for one more song, one more bow. The doors of the showroom have opened, and people from half the world have poured back into the neon night. Yet tonight, Elvis is restless. He is staring past the walls of that hotel suite, past the desert, past the country itself. "I want to see them," he says. "All of them, London, Tokyo, Paris. I want to stand there and hear what it sounds like." Versions of that moment appear again and again in witness recollections. Friends remembered Elvis talking about a real-world tour like it was a dream he kept trying to pull closer. Letters came in from Britain, from Germany, from Australia. Fans who grew up with his voice on tiny radios begged him to come in person. They knew every word. They had waited for years. Inside that room, one man listens. Short, heavy-set, older, eyes that do not miss much. He straightens his tie, shifts his cigar, and answers in the same calm tone Elvis has heard since he was barely out of his teens. "Son, the world is already watching you. Why leave the one place where we control everything? The money is here, the cameras are here, the safety is here. Out there, everything is a risk." To Elvis, it sounds like strategy. The Colonel has always sounded like strategy. For most of Elvis's life, Tom Parker is presented as his guardian and architect, the manager with the miracle touch, the man who pulled a shy Southern boy onto the biggest stages in America and turned him into a king. When Parker says no, people assume he sees something they do not. When Parker refuses to cross an ocean, people shrug and say he is old-fashioned, or maybe he just prefers the sure thing. What Elvis never fully knew, and what the public only began to learn long after he died, is that the Colonel was carrying a secret that had nothing to do with Elvis at all. The man who told the world he was Colonel Tom Parker from West Virginia was not born in America. He was not really a colonel. He had arrived in the United States under another name, from another country, and he had spent the rest of his life building a wall around that fact. Behind that wall lay questions he refused to answer, and possibly a past he could not afford to have examined too closely. That secret did not only shape the Colonel's life, it shaped Elvis's. Every time Parker refused a world tour, every time he steered Elvis back toward safe, domestic deals that kept both of them on American soil, he was not only thinking about Elvis's schedule. He was thinking about his own passport, his own papers, his own fear of what might happen if he ever had to stand in front of another country's officials and explain who he really was. Elvis dreamed about stepping on stages across the world. The man who controlled his contracts could not even step easily onto a plane that left the country. This is the story of that man, of the secret he carried, of the way one hidden life quietly bent the life of the most famous singer on earth, and of how Elvis Presley, for all his power, never fully understood the cage he was inside. To understand the Colonel's darkest secret, you have to start with the myth that made him untouchable. You have to start with how he made Elvis. Section 1, the setup, the magician who made Elvis. Before the questions, before the lawsuits, before the documentaries, there was only gratitude. In 1955, Elvis Presley was already building a regional storm. Southern radio stations spun "That's All Right" and "Baby, Let's Play House." Crowds in small halls screamed and shoved against the stage. Mothers pulled their daughters back by the sleeve and stared at the boy with the slick hair and shaking leg, half scandalized and half amused. What Elvis and his family did not yet know was how quickly that little storm could die. Regional stars flashed and faded all the time. Bad contracts, weak promotion, the wrong tour at the wrong moment, and a career that had looked certain could vanish in a year. Into that fragile space walked a man who seemed to understand exactly how to take a local sensation and hand him the country. He called himself Colonel Tom Parker. On paper, Parker was already a figure in the country music world. He had worked with big names like Eddie Arnold. He had a reputation for being ruthless, loud, and effective. Promoters knew his voice on the phone. Artists knew that if Parker believed in you, he could get you into places that were usually closed. He arrived in Elvis's orbit like a salesman who already knew his product would sell. People who were there remember his confidence. Where other men hesitated, Parker demanded. Where other managers spoke in possibilities, Parker spoke in certainties. He talked about national television, about major labels, about movie screens. He talked about Elvis not as a local act who might make good, but as an inevitability. The way he told it, the only question was whether the Presleys wanted to ride with him or get left behind. For a poor family from Mississippi, that kind of confidence was overwhelming. Elvis had grown up counting every dollar. He had known what it felt like to live in a shotgun house and wonder if there would be enough money for groceries, let alone dreams. The idea that a man with real connections believed his voice was worth fighting for was powerful. The idea that this man promised to handle the ugly side of the business so Elvis could focus on the singing was almost a relief. Within months, Parker helped broker the deal with RCA that would give Elvis national distribution. Suddenly, the music was not confined to a few states. Heartbreak Hotel was blasting out of diners and army bases across the country. Young people who had never set foot in Memphis knew the sound of that voice. From the outside, it looked like a miracle. From the inside, it felt like one. Elvis's father, Vernon, saw checks he had never imagined. The family who had once worried about rent now watched money arrive with each single and tour. Each time the Colonel pushed for another appearance, another record, another contract, it was hard to argue. The formula was working. The boy was famous. The family was safe. With that financial success came something more dangerous than money. It came with trust. Elvis was young, sensitive, and eager to please. Those who knew him well often described a man who responded deeply to praise and loyalty. When someone stood up for him, he remembered it. When someone appeared to protect him, he attached himself to them. Parker understood that. He did not only manage Elvis, he positioned himself as the one person who truly understood what Elvis was up against. He talked about jealous rivals, greedy promoters, and fans who might turn on him. Then he would add a steady reassurance. "You just sing, let me handle the rest." That kind of sentence sinks into a young artist's bones. It sounds like safety. It sounds like love disguised as business. The deals that followed reflected that power balance. Many managers took 10 or 15%. Parker's cut climbed far higher. Some insiders looked at the numbers and shook their heads. They whispered that no manager should earn that much on a single client. They wondered why Elvis did not push back. Elvis rarely did. When friends raised questions, he would shrug or smile. He would say that the Colonel had been there from the beginning. He would point to the houses, the cars, the wild scenes of girls screaming his name, and imply that arguing with success felt ungrateful. This is how dependency is built. Not in one loud moment, but in 100 small choices where you decide it is easier to obey than to confront. While the money flowed, the Colonel steered Elvis's career with a firm hand. The early movies came quickly. Scripts that were light on story and heavy on songs arrived in a steady stream. The films made money. They kept Elvis visible. They kept him busy. Behind closed doors, Elvis sometimes complained about the quality. He read scripts and wished for roles that had weight, challenge, danger. He admired serious actors, wanted to be taken seriously himself. Yet whenever he pushed, the answer was familiar. The Colonel would talk about risk, about how audiences loved the simple formula, about how studios liked certainty. He would remind Elvis of how many people depended on him. Band members, family, crew, the fans who wanted to see him exactly as they imagined him. Again and again, the safe choice won. All the while, there were small details that, in hindsight, looked different. People noticed that the Colonel rarely spoke in detail about his own childhood. Stories about his past were vague, more like tales from a carnival than a clear biography. He joked about being from here or there. He leaned into his title of Colonel, an honorary rank he had been given by a Louisiana governor, and let the nickname cover everything else. When talk of international opportunities surfaced, something else happened. By the late 50s and early 60s, it was obvious that Elvis was not only an American star. Fan mail arrived from Europe as if a dam had broken. British teenagers who would later form their own legendary bands were already listening. Promoters overseas began to ask about tour. Yet each time a serious international plan edged toward reality, it seemed to stall. The Colonel would stress how complicated overseas tour could be. He would talk about expenses, security, the strain on Elvis. He would suggest that movies or television specials could reach even more people without the chaos of travel. The conversations would drift back toward projects that kept Elvis in the United States, close to the Colonel's own base of operations. At the time, most people accepted those explanations. America itself was such a massive market that few questioned why it should not be enough. The image of Elvis as an all-American icon felt like part of his story. The fact that he almost never performed outside North America felt like an odd footnote, not a warning sign. Only later, when researchers began to pull at the loose threads in the Colonel's own story, did those decisions start to look less like caution and more like self-defense. Hidden behind that firm voice and that big cigar was a simple fact. The man running Elvis's life did not have the same freedom to cross a border that Elvis had. He was not a natural-born American. He was not a citizen. He had entered the country as someone else, and he had spent decades avoiding any situation that might require him to show who he truly was. Elvis did not know the full extent of that. He knew the public face, the nickname, the charm. He knew the schedules and the contracts. He knew the feeling of being told that the world would just have to come to him because he would not be going to it. What he did not know was how much of that message came from one man, buried past. The stage was set. The myth of the Colonel as savior had been built. The loyalty had been earned, or at least purchased. The pattern of saying no to the wider world had already begun. Only after Elvis had given his youth, his voice, and his health to that pattern would the questions finally catch up. Only then would people start to ask who Colonel Tom Parker really was, and what he had been hiding all along. The world fell in love with Elvis much faster than anyone around him realized. In London, teenagers cut their hair like his and tried to mimic the curl of his lip in the mirror. In West Germany, young soldiers in American uniforms blasted his records from radios on windowsills. In tiny apartments in Tokyo, students saved coins for imported singles that took months to arrive. Across oceans and borders, a common promise grew quietly. One day he will come here. Fan letters poured in by the thousands. Some were messy and full of spelling mistakes, written by kids who had never left their hometown. Others came from far away, stamped with unfamiliar postmarks and careful handwriting. Writers begged him to stand on their soil, to sing even one song in their language, to prove that the voice on the record belonged to a real man who would cross the same ocean they had only seen on maps. Elvis read those letters. Friends remembered his smile when he opened envelopes from places he had never visited. The idea of walking out on a stage in another country did more than flatter his ego. It made the dream bigger. Fame inside America felt huge. Fame that wrapped around the globe felt like history. Promoters overseas saw the same opportunity. Concert offers drifted in from London, Paris, and beyond. There were plans sketched on paper for international tour that would have shattered records. Organizers spoke in large numbers, sold out arenas, and headlines that would have cemented Elvis not just as an American phenomenon, but as a world ruler of popular music. Each time a serious proposal appeared, it ended the same way. The call went through the Colonel. Tom Parker held the keys to Elvis's calendar, his contracts, and ultimately his movement. No tour happened without his approval. No stage was booked until he decided that the money, the conditions, and the timing felt right. On the surface, his reasoning sounded sensible. International tour meant travel, visas, a larger entourage, and a level of security that a figure like Elvis would absolutely require. Long flights could exhaust a performer who already pushed his body hard. Foreign laws and tax systems could open up a maze of complications. That was how Parker framed it when he talked to journalists and business partners. He would say that the numbers did not justify the risk. He would point out that television specials reached more people than any single concert in a foreign city. He would compare the guaranteed money of Las Vegas residencies or domestic tour with the uncertain balance sheets of overseas ventures. By the time he finished, staying home sounded like wise business. To Elvis, that logic carried extra weight because it came from the man who had already delivered so much. A young man who had trusted Parker with his first big decisions struggled to suddenly tell him he was wrong. Loyalty and gratitude pressed down on every conversation. When the Colonel said that the world could come to Elvis through cameras and broadcast satellites, the argument twisted into a compliment. The singer did not need to fly overseas because he was already too valuable to risk. Underneath those explanations lay a quieter truth. The man who advised Elvis to stay within American borders was not just cautious. He was trapped in his own way. Colonel Tom Parker had built his public identity carefully. He wore the Southern nickname with pride. He told stories that painted him as a self-made American hustler who had earned his stripes in carnivals and on campaign trails. The honorary rank from a Louisiana governor became an anchor. Somewhere along the way, he allowed the idea to form that he had been born in the United States. That idea was not true. Researchers later uncovered that Parker entered the world as Andreas van Kuijk, born in the Netherlands. As a young man, he left Europe and eventually turned up in America, where the new life began. The old name faded. The accent softened into something else. The past blurred by design. Citizenship never followed. Official records do not show a clear path to naturalization. For reasons he took to his grave, Parker remained a man without the simple document that most of his countrymen carried. That single missing piece of paper changed everything. A manager with no American passport faced immediate problems when thoughts turned to travel overseas. Leaving the country meant exposing himself to authorities, filling out forms, answering questions about birthplaces, parents, and previous names. Returning might involve even more scrutiny. Any unresolved issue from his early life could rise like a ghost on a government desk. A man in that position does not only fear foreign soil, he fears anyone who might force him to step onto it. So while Elvis dreamed about foreign stages, the colonel looked at maps and saw something else. Every border was a risk. Every customs officer was a potential threat. Every overseas tour was an invitation for someone somewhere to ask the wrong question. Fear like that rarely shows itself openly. It hides behind strategy. When Parker argued against international tour, his language focused on Elvis. He talked about the star's comfort. He talked about the pressure on the performer. He talked about hazards that could harm the act they had built. The conversation never included the phrase, "I cannot go," even if that feeling sat in his chest every time a promoter overseas picked up the phone. Business decisions that seemed conservative in the moment created a pattern over years. Elvis's army service in Germany left fans sure that he would return one day on his own terms. The fact that he had once lived among European towns as a soldier made the idea of performing there seem natural. Imagine the headline: the world's biggest rock and roll star returning to the continent where his uniform had once blended into the crowd. That show never happened. After he came home, the focus shifted back to films, recording sessions, and domestic tour. Overseas offers floated around the edges, but the colonel's attention narrowed to projects that kept Elvis planted firmly on American ground. Hollywood studios sat just a few hours from Graceland by plane. Las Vegas was only a domestic flight away. No passports, no border officials, no foreign forms, no questions about a Dutch past that nobody in Elvis's circle had ever seen. The 1968 television special offered another chance to alter the path. Elvis stood in that black leather outfit and reminded the world that he was still electric. The special reached into living rooms across several countries. Viewers who had grown up with his records suddenly saw a sharper, more alive version of the man they feared had been lost to weak films and tame soundtracks. Momentum roared back. In that surge of energy, a more aggressive world plan might have carried him to stages abroad. Instead, the colonel doubled down on a strategy that suited him personally. Concerts in Las Vegas, arranged with long-term deals, surrounded by people he knew, became the backbone of Elvis's later career. The city was inside the same national borders Parker had carefully chosen years before. Casinos liked stability and repetition. Managers who preferred predictability thrived there. From a distance, it looked like savvy management. Las Vegas residencies paid enormous sums. A fixed base of operations allowed the colonel to negotiate strong contracts, set up merchandising, and keep the machine running at a controlled pace. Each time someone suggested that the king should visit the countries that had crowned him in their hearts, the same reasoning appeared. Why go there when the world keeps coming here? Elvis felt the limits more than he admitted. Friends described conversations where he wondered aloud why other acts traveled so freely. Bands that had grown up listening to his records toured Europe and Asia as part of their normal routine. New stars crossed oceans with apparent ease while the man who had lit the fuse stayed home. Restlessness crept in around the edges of his success. Hotel rooms that looked grand from the outside began to feel like gilded cages. Every night, the same kinds of crowds filled the same kinds of seats. Every morning, the same schedule awaited him. The world outside the United States became less a reality and more a story told by other people. He could have asked harder questions. He could have demanded explanations. That kind of confrontation sat outside his nature. Elvis had been raised to respect older authority, especially men who presented themselves as caretakers. Gratefulness for his rise, love for his family, and fear of tearing apart the structure that kept so many people employed all mixed together. Arguing with the colonel meant risking more than a single contract. It meant risking the entire system he had known as an adult. Loyalty has a price when the person you are loyal to refuses to tell you everything. Behind closed doors, the colonel's fear never relaxed. A man who had built his life on a changed name and a hidden origin understood on a deep level how fragile that sort of construction can be. The more famous Elvis became, the greater the risk that someone, somewhere, would start to dig into the manager who hovered just behind the star like a shadow. A world tour would have brought press conferences, official receptions, and visa applications in unfamiliar languages. Reporters who had already heard rumors might have pressed harder. Photographers might have aimed lenses not only at the singer, but at the round man in the hat who always spoke first when business came up. Limiting Elvis's geography also limited the number of eyes assessing the colonel. In a strange way, the most powerful entertainer on earth found his choices narrowed by a man who felt powerless to face his own history. The longer this pattern continued, the easier it became to explain it away. Fans told themselves that Elvis simply preferred America. Journalists repeated the line that he did not need to travel because the world already came to him. People who loved him swallowed the sadness that came with that assumption and moved on. Very few understood that each missed tour date, each canceled possibility, and each ignored overseas invitation was part of a defensive wall built by someone else. Through the late 60s and into the 70s, Elvis's life followed paths that suited the colonel's comfort more than his own restless imagination. New recording projects existed, yet the heavy center of his workload sat inside the same country that had once welcomed Andreas Van Kuik under a new name. Every time the curtain rose in Las Vegas, it symbolized another night that he was not in London or Sydney or Rio. Whispers about the colonel's background existed in small corners of the industry. A few people muttered that his birth story did not add up. Some suspected a foreign origin. Almost nobody had proof, and even fewer had the courage or interest to confront him directly. His reputation for toughness and his position at the top of the Elvis machine made him a difficult man to challenge. Elvis remained the last person anyone wanted to hurt with unpleasant discoveries. So the secret stayed in the manager's hands, where it had always lived. Elvis kept singing the songs fed into the set lists. Crowds kept cheering. Casino owners kept smiling at the figures on their ledgers. The feeling that something important had been left unexplored, that entire parts of the world had been left unvisited, sat like a quiet ache beneath the surface. Only after Elvis was gone would investigators begin to pull at the threads in the colonel's story. Only then would the truth about the man who said no to the world start to step out of the shadows, and only then would people dare to ask the question that Elvis never truly had the chance to face. In the end, Elvis Presley did not leave this world on a stage, under bright lights, in front of an audience that could tell him goodbye. He died in a house that had become both fortress and museum, surrounded by people who loved him and systems that depended on him. Years of relentless work, poor health, prescription drugs, and emotional strain had taken their toll. The man who once moved like electricity now lived with a body that was overworked and exhausted. The pattern that helped break him had a familiar shape. Night after night, the same cycle repeated. Hotel rooms, planes, cars, dressing rooms, then the glare of a Las Vegas showroom or another American arena. Songs that used to feel sharp and dangerous became part of a routine. Some nights the old fire broke through and everyone in the room felt it. Other nights the performance looked more like duty than joy. The machine did not slow down. Contracts had to be honored. Casinos expected full houses. Record labels needed new material even if the songs did not always match the level of his earlier work. All of those demands flowed through one central office, the office of Colonel Tom Parker. As long as the colonel kept the calendar full, the money stayed strong. As long as Elvis stepped on stage when asked, the system continued. Friends noticed changes. They spoke years later of a man who carried weariness in his eyes even when the crowd roared. Interviews from that period often show Elvis trying to balance gratitude with something harder to name. He knew that millions still adored him. He also knew that the life he lived did not look much like the life he had imagined when he first held a guitar in a tiny house in Tupelo. When the news of his death broke in August 1977, shock raced around the world in seconds. Radio hosts choked on their words. Fans cried in parking lots and kitchens. In cities where he had never set foot, people who had waited for a concert that never came lit candles and played records until the grooves nearly wore out. For many, it felt as if a family member had gone. Inside the business side of his world, another kind of rush began. The moment a star that large dies, questions crash in from every direction. Newspapers want details. Television networks scramble to assemble special programs. Lawyers reach for contracts. Executors of estates look for wills, ownership documents, and exact lists of who controls what. In Elvis's case, the tangle was immense. For more than 2 decades, the Colonel had been the chief architect of every major deal. His fingerprints covered movie contracts, touring agreements, merchandising rights, and promotional arrangements that tied Elvis's name to a long list of products and appearances. That level of involvement meant that when Elvis died, Parker did not simply vanish into the background. He stepped forward once again as the man who knew where everything was. Reports from those days often describe the Colonel attending meetings, speaking with the same self-assurance that had once impressed the Presleys in the 1950s. He advised on how to manage the flood of tribute projects. He discussed the future of the brand. He made phone calls about memorial events and posthumous releases. To some, it looked like loyalty. To others, it looked like a man protecting his interests. Grief had not yet settled when another feeling crept in among the lawyers and accountants: suspicion. The Presley estate began to look closely at the numbers. Graceland and the people who now had to manage Elvis's legacy wanted clarity. How much had the Colonel earned over the years? How had those percentages been structured? Were the huge cuts he took ever properly examined while Elvis was alive? During the early days of success, few had the courage or the knowledge to question Parker's deals. After the star was gone, hesitation faded. Audits started. Papers that had once sat quietly in filing cabinets now became evidence in negotiations and courtrooms. Lawyers followed the trail of money from concerts, films, television specials, and merchandise. Contracts that had been signed with trust and a sense of gratitude now looked different under cold, fluorescent lights. Many observers were struck by the scale of Parker's share. Legal challenges claimed that his percentage of Elvis's earnings went far beyond standard practice. Some argued that no manager should have held that level of financial power over a single client. Court cases and settlements followed, with judges and arbitrators forced to decide whether the arrangement had crossed the line from aggressive business to exploitation. Through it all, the Colonel maintained that he had earned every cent. He pointed to the fame Elvis achieved and the fortunes that passed through the Presley home. He emphasized the risks he had taken and the deals he had orchestrated. In his mind, his cut reflected the value he brought. Financial questions were only one front. Another set of questions aimed directly at the Colonel's identity. Once people started to pry into his business, they began to pry into his past. Biographers, journalists, and curious researchers dug into old records. The public story of Colonel Tom Parker from West Virginia started to crack. Immigration files, foreign documents, and testimonies from people overseas formed a new picture. This picture did not show a man born and raised in the American South. It showed a young Dutchman named Andreas van Kuijk who had crossed the ocean and then done everything possible to bury that original name. Evidence suggested that Parker had left the Netherlands suddenly as a young man and never returned. Family members from that country later identified him. Some accounts whispered about unresolved questions back home, including an old crime that may or may not have involved him. Hard proof on those accusations remained thin, and historians still debate the exact details. What remained solid was the fact that he had abandoned his birth identity, and that he had never become a citizen of the United States. That revelation changed how people looked at everything else. A manager with no citizenship and a hidden name did not simply avoid foreign travel because he disliked flying. He had practical reasons to fear it. Crossing borders would require documentation, scrutiny, and official questions about origins. A man who had spent decades hiding his old life would naturally resist any situation that forced him to open that door. Once that truth became public, the old decisions about Elvis's career looked different. Fans and writers began to connect dots. The lack of international touring did not fit the pattern of other major performers. Artists with smaller profiles had traveled the world many times over. Elvis, who moved history with his voice, had almost never left the continent as a performer. Now the reason that had been shrugged off as caution or preference began to feel like something else. The Colonel's fear had become Elvis's limitation. Every time Parker declined a world tour proposal, he protected himself from visa applications and passport control. Each Las Vegas contract that tied Elvis to a single city for months also ensured that the manager did not have to wander far from his own comfort zone. When the singer stayed home, the secret stayed safe. That realization did not sit easily with those who admired Elvis's talent. The knowledge that entire generations overseas never saw him in person because of one man's hidden past stung. Millions had grown up with his records on cheap turntables. Crowds in countries he never visited had shouted his lyrics in tiny clubs and bedrooms. For them, the idea that he could have stood in front of them but never did because of another person's fear felt like a theft. No document can calculate what that absence cost. The financial loss alone would have been huge. World tour at his peak would have filled stadiums and broken records. Licensing deals built around international concerts would have raised even more revenue for the Presley family. Those numbers, however, are only one side of the ledger. The emotional cost cuts deeper. Performing in Europe, Asia, and beyond might have shifted something inside Elvis himself. New cultures, new audiences, and new streets could have shaken him out of the routine that eventually weighed him down. Faces in foreign cities might have reminded him of why he loved music in the first place. A demanding global tour might have been dangerous for his health, yet it also might have changed his path. No one can say for certain what would have happened. Only one fact stands firm. Elvis never had the chance to decide for himself with full information. He knew that the Colonel said no often. He knew that the official reasons focused on security and business. He knew that the life he led felt more and more confined. He did not know that the man pulling the strings refused to reveal the full story of his own background. That is where the deepest wound lies. Many artists live under strict managers. Many sign contracts they later regret. Many feel trapped by schedules and obligations. Elvis's situation included all of that, but added another cruel twist. The cage around him was shaped by a fear that did not even belong to him. The secret in question was not about Elvis's own mistakes, crimes, or scandals. It was about his manager's unresolved past in a country far away. A young man who had left the Netherlands as Andreas van Kuijk later reshaped himself as Colonel Tom Parker, and then used that constructed identity to control every step of Elvis's journey. The person who paid the highest price for that arrangement never saw the full terms. Once fans and historians absorbed that truth, they struggled with the balance. On one side stood the argument that Parker made Elvis into a global name. Without his early hustle, the shy singer from Tupelo might never have left the South in a meaningful way. Aggressive negotiation and relentless promotion did contribute to the creation of the legend. On the other side stood the evidence that the same man who launched him also kept him from exploring his full reach. Self-protection had blended with business decisions until the line between them vanished. A manager who feared leaving the country nudged his client into a career that did not require it. Conversations about the Colonel grew sharper. Some called him a necessary evil. Others painted him as a villain who drained Elvis's career for profit. A few tried to see him as a tragic figure, someone who carried panic from his youth and made every choice through that lens. All of those views circle the same central point. The man who held the power never trusted the world enough to tell it who he truly was. That lack of honesty rippled outward, touching every contract, every tour, every stage Elvis never stood on. It colored the way his final years unfolded, and it hung like a shadow over the moment of his death. A star who loved his fans sincerely had been steered for decades by a handler who guarded his own secret more tightly than he guarded his artist's dreams. By the time the full story came out, Elvis was no longer here to respond. He could not confront the man who had guided him. He could not ask why vital information had been kept from him. He could not tell the world whether he would have walked away, renegotiated, or forgiven. The only voices left were those of witnesses, researchers, and fans trying to make sense of a partnership that had created history and heartbreak at the same time. That is the cruel irony at the center of this tale. The truth about the Colonel rose from the shadows only when the one person who most deserved to hear it could no longer listen. In every photograph, Elvis looks as if he belongs to the entire world. Records spun in cities he never visited. Posters of his face hung on bedroom walls from London to Lagos. Teenagers in Mexico, Sweden, and Japan tried to copy his hair, his stance, that unexplainable mix of danger and vulnerability. For millions of people, Elvis was not an American singer. He was simply Elvis, as if the name itself floated above borders. Inside that myth, a quieter truth sits uncomfortably. This global figure rarely left his own country after fame took hold. Apart from the army years and a handful of early appearances close to the border, his career unfolded on familiar soil. Night after night, he walked out onto stages in American cities, while crowds overseas filled smaller halls to watch grainy films or television reruns and wonder what it would feel like to stand in the same room as him. That gap between image and reality forms a big part of his legacy. Fans still argue in comment sections about what might have happened if he had toured the world. Some imagine European stadiums, seas of lighter flames and flags. Others picture Elvis in Tokyo, trying a few words in Japanese and laughing when he got them wrong. Those images exist only in fantasy because the decisions that shaped his career never gave him the chance. At the center of those decisions stood Colonel Tom Parker. Every serious attempt to tell Elvis's story now has to wrestle with the Colonel. It is impossible to talk honestly about the king without talking about the man who steered him, protected him, and limited him all at once. Historians, fans, and former insiders keep circling the same set of questions. Was Parker the mastermind who lifted Elvis from poverty to legend? Or was he the handler who squeezed him for profit while hiding behind a false identity? The answer rarely lands on one side. On one hand, early success carried the Colonel's fingerprints everywhere. The RCA deal, the television breakthroughs, the carefully staged moments that turned a talented Southern boy into a national event did not fall from the sky. A tough, relentless manager worked those phones, hammered out those contracts, and pushed a shy singer into arenas his family could barely imagine. On the other hand, the same man arranged an agreement that took a staggering share of Elvis's earnings. The same man resisted almost every serious international tour proposal. The same man lived behind a name that did not belong to his birth and avoided citizenship in a country whose flag his client wrapped around entire audiences. When the truth about Parker's Dutch origins became widely known, people began to redraw the map of responsibility. Before that revelation, critics often framed the Colonel as simply greedy or narrow-minded. Once his hidden identity came into focus, the story deepened. Now it became clear that fear of exposure sat under the business language. Global tour did not only threaten to tire Elvis. They threatened to put the manager in front of officials who might ask him where he came from and why his paperwork did not match his claims. Reframing the Colonel forces a reframing of Elvis. The king now appears not only as a star pushed too hard, but as a man whose choices were narrowed by another person's secret. He was loyal to someone who never trusted him with the full truth. He made life-changing decisions based on information that had been filtered to protect someone else's past. That knowledge casts his loyalty in a harsher light. Friends often described Elvis as a man who valued loyalty almost above anything. Childhood poverty had taught him how fragile life could be. The early kindness of people who helped his family stuck with him. When those who stood beside him in his rise asked for trust in return, he gave it readily. A manager who had shepherded him through his earliest storms naturally sat in that circle. In that context, his long partnership with the Colonel looks less like weakness and more like a tragic collision between character and circumstance. A generous man who hated confrontation met a manager who depended on secrecy. Each year that passed tied their lives tighter together, until separating business from loyalty became nearly impossible. Modern audiences sit with that tension when they look back at his life. Some viewers feel anger toward Parker. For them, the Colonel symbolizes everything dangerous about unequal power in the entertainment world. A young artist with no legal training signs papers that bind him to a figure who always knows more and reveals less. The result, in their eyes, is exploitation dressed as partnership. Other viewers feel a complicated mixture of respect and resentment. They see a manager who genuinely believed in his act and worked tirelessly to make him a legend, yet never found the courage to tell that act the whole story. In this interpretation, Parker becomes almost as tragic as Elvis. A man who fled his own past, then spent decades building a golden cage for the one person who trusted him most. Still others try to imagine a version of history where both men made different choices. Picture a world where the colonel came clean early. In that scenario, a young Elvis learns that his manager is actually a Dutch immigrant with unresolved issues overseas. The information shocks him. The revelation might lead to legal help, immigration lawyers, and attempts to fix the status. Perhaps they succeed and the passport appears. Perhaps they fail and part ways. Either way, Elvis at least knows what he is dealing with. Reality gave him no such clarity. He died without public knowledge of Andreas Van Kuwijk. He never stood in a courtroom hearing lawyers debate whether his manager's percentage was fair. He never read the investigative books that would later reveal how deeply his career had been shaped by fear that was not his own. That absence of knowledge shapes how we see him now. When fans watch the 1968 special or the Aloha from Hawaii broadcast, they often feel a tightness in their chest. Those performances show a man who still owned his gift. The voice cuts through time. The charisma has not dimmed. Knowing that he could have walked onto stages abroad at that level, yet never did, adds a layer of bittersweet ache to every note. People who loved him try to hold two images together. In one image, Elvis stands under hot lights in Las Vegas, singing to a crowd that flew in from half the world, while a manager counts receipts and plans the next run. In the other, he stands in a stadium in London, or a massive hall in Tokyo, or an open field in South America, singing to people who never had to cross an ocean just to be in the same room. Only one of those images belongs to reality. The difference between them is the colonel's secret. That secret does not erase Elvis's own agency. He made choices, signed contracts, and stayed in systems even after he understood that they drained him. He spoke up sometimes, went quiet other times, and lived with the tension between art and obligation like so many other performers. Yet no fair telling of his story can ignore the weight of what he did not know. In that sense, the title of this story becomes less about one man and more about a pattern. There are many young talents who walk into offices and hand over power to older figures. Managers, agents, producers, and executives offer pathways to success at a cost that does not always seem clear at the time. Hidden motives, buried pasts, and secret fears often lurk behind polite smiles and confident handshakes. When those secrets begin to steer the lives of the artists, careers twist in ways that still feel like personal choice, even though options were removed long before. Elvis's partnership with the Colonel stands as one of the most famous examples of that dynamic. The lesson it offers reaches far beyond Graceland and Las Vegas. It speaks to anyone who has ever placed their future in the hands of someone who holds back important truths. It warns that loyalty without full knowledge can turn into a weapon that cuts in the wrong direction. At the same time, this story changes how many people feel when they speak about Elvis himself. For years, some critics dismissed his later career as proof that he burned out, lost focus, or gave in to comfort. The facts about Parker's hidden life and controlling grip on the business add nuance. Now, fatigue and decline look less like simple self-indulgence and more like the natural outcome of a structure that kept asking for more shows, more money, more repetition, while limiting the kind of change that might have revived him. The man at the center becomes easier to empathize with once that structure is visible. A young dreamer from Mississippi never set out to become a symbol of artistic confinement. He wanted to sing, to move people, to lift his family out of poverty. A global icon grew from that desire. A complex system of contracts and secrecy grew around it. In the space between those two growths, a human life struggled to breathe. When modern fans stand at the gates of Graceland, many carry these layers in their hearts. Some come with pure nostalgia and leave flowers for the boy whose voice scored their youth. Others arrive with questions about fame, power, and the forces that crushed him. Most leave with a mix of admiration and sorrow that is hard to put into words. They walk away knowing that the story of Elvis Presley contains more shadows than the early marketing ever admitted. The Colonel's darkest secret sits among those shadows, still pulsing with consequences. Revealing that secret did not change the end of Elvis's life, but it did change how the journey is understood. It shifted blame, softened certain judgments, and sharpened others. It turned the simple narrative of a greedy manager and a naive star into something far more human and far more unsettling. Two men, each haunted by different fears, locked paths in a way that shaped music history. The world will keep listening to the songs. Future generations will still discover him on dusty vinyl, on digital playlists, in documentaries, and in clips that appear without warning in social feeds. Little kids will still swivel their hips in living rooms when that voice blasts through speakers. Covers and tributes will keep rewinding the same magic. Yet every time a listener learns that Elvis never toured the world because his manager hid a different name and a different past, the meaning of that magic bends slightly. In that bend lies the true impact of the Colonel's darkest secret. It did not just keep a man from boarding planes. It kept him from seeing just how far his own light could have reached if the person standing in his shadow had trusted him enough to tell the truth. He sang to the world without ever truly standing in front of it. Somewhere inside that fact, a question lingers that no one can answer now. If Elvis had known everything about the man who guided him, would he have stayed? Or would he have finally stepped off the familiar stage and walked into the wide, waiting dark on his own terms? If Elvis had been told the full truth about the Colonel's past, and the real reason he never left America, what do you think he would have done? Fired him and risked everything, or stayed loyal and lived with the cage? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this kind of deep dive into the real story behind the legend speaks to you, tap like, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications so you will not miss the next chapter.